The German Revolution had put the Social Democrats in power of a country that was already suffering from the effects of inflation. Violence in the streets, a shortage of goods, and an upcoming election all happened in the first few months of 1919. In this video, the third in the series on the Weimar hyperinflation, we're going to take a look at all these aspects and compare the beginnings of the inflation in Germany with those of other countries in Europe, such as Austria and Russia. We're going to answer the question, was the Weimar Republic weak? And we're also going to hear the story of how one man single-handedly saved Austria from a Bolshevik revolution. This is Bank Wars, the Weimar hyperinflation. In the last episode of this series, we saw the Spartacist uprising be put down, but it wasn't the only far-left uprising in the early Weimar years. There were loads of riots, strikes, and more during this time, and generally the Weimar Republic was rocked by instability. This has led some to conclude that the Weimar Republic was weak, an argument we'll come back to discuss later in the video. And to go through every single one of these riots and other events would take far too long and distract us from the main hyperinflation issue. But to give you an idea of the sort of things that were happening at the time, I'll briefly mention one notable example. On the 7th of November 1918, before the Social Democrats seized power all over Germany, Kurt Eisner, a Jewish revolutionary from the Bavarian Independent Social Democrats, conducted a putsch in Munich and founded a far-left Bavarian Soviet Republic, also known as the People's State of Bavaria. Eisner wanted independence from the Weimar Republic and attempted to reform the capitalist system into a socialist one, although he promised that they would not do what Lenin had done in Russia. Well, a soldier called Adolf Hitler was elected twice into the Soldiers' Soviet Council and became the deputy battalion representative. He was elected by his fellow Red Army soldiers, who also overwhelmingly voted for the Social Democrats in January 1919, meaning that they thought that Hitler best represented their socialist views, although there is some debate surrounding this. There is film footage and a still photograph showing him, Hitler, marching in the funeral procession of the Bavarian independent leader Kurt Eisner, wearing a black mourning armband and another red one in support of the socialist government. Here is, in fact, the still photo. I can't show the footage of Eisner's funeral because I don't want my video to get copyright striked, but I have seen it, and Hitler is definitely in it. I don't want to bog this video down too much on the debate surrounding this, so I plan to do a separate video soon, specifically on what Hitler was doing in a radical far-left Soviet regime, and why he was part of the funeral procession for a Jewish revolutionary. Needless to say, though, it's because he was a socialist, even if most historians are trying to make excuses as to why he wasn't. Also in that video, I'll be showing you why the Freikorps wasn't always a far-right entity, and in fact many leftists fought in the Freikorps, so be sure to check out that video when it releases because it's really interesting stuff. Speaking of socialists, Ebert, leader of the majority socialists of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, had come to power in November 1918 and had survived the Second Revolution in January 1919. But Ebert understood that his socialist regime wasn't universally popular, especially with the soldiers who had fought on the Western Front, and while Ebert had secured loyalty of the army command, he had to promise to crush all communist uprisings and call for an election in return. Well, a few days after the Spartacist uprising in January 1919, that election took place. And this was the first election since 1912. It was also the first time that women could vote in Germany, and in fact there were 2.8 million more women voters than men. Depending on the source, Germany lost 1.6 to 2 million men killed and another 3.5 to 4.2 million men wounded in the First World War, so that's mostly why there were more women voters than men. The election would dictate the course of the Republic, as whoever was in power would be able to write the Weimar's constitution, and this is where we get into the debate surrounding whether Weimar democracy was weak or not, and whether democracy works or not. The Weimar Republic used a proportional representation system for counting votes, and this was actually more democratic and more liberal than most other countries at the time, but it had its problems. Every adult in Germany couldn't just take a trip to Berlin and then all pile into the Reichstag, nor could they spend their entire days mailing votes. So direct democracy wasn't possible. Instead, the idea was that people would vote for a representative who would go to the parliament, the Reichstag, and vote on behalf of the people who had elected them. Now, even if we assume that one guy could represent the views of 60,000 people, which is clearly impossible, a problem arises when it comes to electing this individual. Let's say that 120,000 people vote for Party A and only 60,000 people vote for Party B in the same area. Party A gets elected, and the views of the losing 60,000 people are ignored. A huge portion of the voters are therefore unrepresented in the supposedly democratic parliament. I mean, how can you call it a representative democracy, people power, if a huge portion of the people are just not represented? This is, in fact, the way that the United Kingdom conducts its elections and is known as the first-past-the-post system. Such a system usually results in two main parties and a bunch of tiny irrelevant ones. This grants the elite dictatorial power under the guise of a two-party system that's supposedly meant to serve the people. But in the Weimar Republic, they used a proportional representation system. 120,000 people would vote for Party A and 60,000 would vote for Party B. And since every 60,000 votes would grant a representative in the parliament, Party A would get 2 seats, 2 representatives, and Party B would get another seat in the parliament. What this meant was that almost everyone had a representative in the parliament, and this was real democracy, apparently. The problem, though, is that everyone had a representative in the parliament. So, there were parties like the German Hanoverian Party, the Schleswig-Holstein Farmers and Farm Workers Democracy Party, and the Brunswick State Electoral Association, all of which got roughly 60,000 votes and a seat in the parliament. Then there were other parties like the Bavarian Peasants' League that got 4 seats, and the German People's Party that got 19 seats, and the Independent Social Democratic Party that got 22 seats, and the German National People's Party, the DNVP, that got 44 seats. The argument goes that all these little parties made it difficult to form a stable government, as the leading party would have to form an alliance with one or more of the other parties in order to get enough seats in the parliament to do anything. During the election of 1919, unprecedented numbers of people turned out, 30 million in fact, and even though some of the books state the exact opposite, the majority of voters voted for statist or socialist parties. The Social Democrats won 163 seats and 37.86% of the vote, making them the largest party. The Independent Socialists won 22 seats and 7.62% of the vote. Together, that gave them 45.48% of the vote, which was a significant amount. However, the main thing to note was that, while the majority of the Germans weren't keen on socialism, they were keen on democracy. The German Democratic Party, the DDP, gained 18.56% of the vote, and the Catholic Centre Party, also known as the Zentrum Party, gained 19.67% of the vote. If you add up the pro-democracy parties, the Social Democrats, the Zentrum and the German Democratic Party, then you find that 76.09% of all the votes cast were in favour of democracy. A myth has developed that the German people were not interested in democracy. But that clearly is not the case in 1919. Also, given current political views, this fact is very interesting. The majority of women voters did not vote for political parties of the left, which tended to be more strongly supported by men, but for the centre-right and nationalist right. But despite their inclination to vote for centrist parties or for the conservative right, female representation within the National Assembly was strongest in the parties of the left, notably in the two social democratic parties, the MSPD and the USPD. But here's the supposed problem. Because of proportional representation, the SPD had only got 163 seats, which was 37.86% of the votes. So, in order for them to get the 50% of the seats needed to pass anything, they would have to ally themselves with another party or parties that had won at least 12.5% of the vote. And in order to get that alliance, they would need to negotiate and compromise and so on. So the argument is that the Weimar Republic was weak because its proportional representation system caused minority governments that were forced to form weak coalitions, and this meant that hardly anything got done. Between 13th of February 1919 and the 30th of January 1933, there were no fewer than 20 different cabinets, each lasting on average 239 days, or somewhat less than 8 months. Coalition government, it was sometimes said, made for unstable government, as the different parties were constantly squabbling over personalities and policies. It also made for weak government, since all they could settle on was the lowest common denominator and the line of least resistance. There's several counters to this, the primary one being that most of the parties were socialist anyway. In fact, the only party that actually wanted free market economics was the DNVP, the German National People's Party, and they were the fourth largest party in 1919 with only 10% of the vote and 44 seats, which was simply not enough to actually do anything. Worse, their party wasn't solidified, since they were a coalition of old liberal and conservative groups which didn't necessarily see eye to eye. The rest of the parties, including the Catholic Zentrum Party, were pro-statism and pro-protectionism, with the vast majority being actual socialist. So a coalition could quite easily be formed by any of these statist parties. Also, the Weimar government was strong regardless of who was elected in the parliament, because of the position of the president and Article 48 of the soon-to-be-written Weimar Constitution. Let me explain. Ebert was officially made the new president of the Weimar Republic and could remain in office for a total of 7 years, although this ended up being extended. He did in fact remain president until 1925 when he died. 2 other presidents were temporarily appointed for a period of 73 days before Hindenburg was elected, who would go on to be president until Hitler took over the position in 1934. So really, Ebert was basically one of the only 2 Weimar presidents and exercised dictatorial power during the early years of the Republic. Article 48 of the Constitution allowed the president to rule by decree and send in the army to restore order if the state was under threat. Ebert would use Article 48 a total of 63 times in 1923 and 1924 alone, as the Weimar hyperinflationary crisis heightened, and would use it a total of 134 times during his rule. This is important for 2 reasons. First, it shows that the Weimar Republic did actually have strength. And secondly, I had people arguing with me in the previous videos saying that the socialists weren't in power during the Weimar hyperinflationary crisis, so therefore, they said, it can't be blamed on them. Well, not only did the main socialist parties set up the conditions for the hyperinflation when they were in power, and then were the main opposition party during the hyperinflation, but President Ebert was in power too and was exercising that power via Article 48. So the socialists are the main player in all of this, and the Weimar government was strong because of Article 48. To show how strong the position of the president was, after being elected, Ebert immediately demanded an Anschluss of Austria. Yes, I did just say that. Ebert, the Social Democrat, was calling for the unification of the German people, beating Hitler to the punch by almost 2 decades. Now, we're going to talk about the Treaty of Versailles and the war reparations in a future episode, but to briefly explain this, President Wilson had called for the self-determination of the various peoples in Europe, and since the Germans were a people, it made sense to unite them in one nation. And to do that, it would require the German Austrians to be Anschlussed into the Republic. Of course, the victorious powers refused to grant this, but the fact is, Ebert had called for it, and the Anschluss idea was actually a left-wing idea. Gowarth, in his book November 1918, says that the Anschluss concept moved from being a left-wing project to one associated with the far right. But the problem is, National Socialism seems to have a lot of left-wing socialist policies, including the Anschluss idea. Perhaps it's because they're not on the far right, but are actually on the left? It would make a lot of sense if they were, wouldn't it? Of course, Ebert understood that the economic situation in Germany was bad. The Kaiser's government had borrowed and printed their way through a war which they then lost, leaving the new regime to deal with the consequences. But instead of just going back to sound money and letting the free market operate, Ebert, of course, was a socialist and decided that the state would have to step in to wipe out unemployment and help everybody by just spending even more currency. Payments had to be made to soldiers who had lost their limbs, widows and orphans. Food supplies were subsidised, as were certain industries to achieve full employment and maintain the social peace. Meanwhile, inflation rates continued to be high, making the purchase of basic commodities and imports more and more expensive. A couple of points here. If you have a factory that's only producing half of the goods it used to do, and therefore only has half the employees, the reason why is because the goods that the factory produces aren't in demand. If they were, then the factory would see the price of its goods rise and would therefore take on more employees in order to fill the gap and make more profit. So when the state steps in, prints a bunch of new currency and throws it at the factory owner, telling him to employ more people, what does that do? Yes, it puts more people in a job, but it also means that they're producing things that people don't actually want or need, because again, if they needed them, then the factory owner would have employed them without the need for subsidies. So what ends up happening is the businesses that shouldn't be operating at full capacity, or shouldn't be expanding, or should be shutting down, are bribed into expanding and taking on more hands, which increases the price of labour and robs workers from other businesses that actually do have that demand, increasing their operating costs and preventing them from growing. Thus, you have a mismatch in the economy where bad businesses are encouraged and good businesses are hindered. Yes, you have full employment and GDP, gross domestic product, does grow because the bad factories employed more workers to produce goods that nobody wants, and this leads some historians and economists to conclude that the economy was strong. Between the end of the war and the summer of 1922, economic growth rates in Germany were actually higher and unemployment rates lower than those in most other European countries. Some historians have even suggested that the early Weimar governments brought much-needed social peace and precarious stability by excessive use of the printing press. But in reality, the Weimar Republic at this time wasn't stable in any sense of the word, and the economy was fundamentally weak. There's massive distortions within it, and as soon as the currency printing stops, or if the people abandon the currency, oh boy, we'll get to that when it happens. But it gets worse. Unions were also on strike a lot, further reducing productivity, and because union membership grew from 2.5 million in 1913 to 5.5 million in 1919, it looked as though the workers might rise up and take the businesses off the owners or even worse. Thus, German industry had to adapt to this, which they did by integrating the workers into their businesses. Even before 1914, German industry had already developed along lines that diverged consciously from the free market individualist Manchesterism of Britain and the USA, and the passions and necessities of war had done much to move the Reich's economy towards a kind of corporate socialism that was even more peculiarly German. But not so much socialism that Russian conditions would be created, for both the prosperous classes and the majority of workers did not want Bolshevism. The threat that the socialist government posed was felt so keenly by the business owners that they were willing to make a deal with it in order to prevent any seizure of the means of production and the redistribution of property. The deal was known as the Stinnes-Legion Agreement and was made on the 15th of November 1918. Hugo Stinnes was a leading industrialist who would end up becoming infamous in the story of the Weimar hyperinflation, and Karl Legion was the chairman of the free trade unions. The good news was that the Soviet-style socialization of the means of production was avoided. The bad news was that the labour movement got most of what it had demanded for decades. They were allowed to form workers' councils, Soviets, within all businesses that had over 50 employees. All workers returning from military service were entitled to their previous jobs, and the business leaders officially recognised the trade unions and representatives of the workforce. All of this meant that less people were actually working and more people were yapping. But perhaps most importantly was the introduction of the 8-hour workday and full compensation for the reduction of hours. Previously, let's say someone was working 10 hours a day, they were now restricted to 8 hours, but would still be paid the same amount as if they had worked 10 hours. Well, what happens when you lower productivity and boost the number of currency units? You get higher prices. Now, prices were rising anyway because of the printing press, but this deal would push up prices even more, lowering living standards and causing goods shortages. The new state also guaranteed wages, pensions and more to the government public sector employees, and again the same applies here. Government employees don't produce anything. What does a civil servant produce? What does a taxman produce? What does a politician produce, apart from problems? The answer is nothing. Same with pensioners. Now, you might argue that we need to have nationalised pensions instead of private ones for some reason, or that it is right to pay war widows and look after orphans, and that's fine, but you've got to think of the unintended consequences. Government employees, pensioners, widows and children don't produce anything, they just consume resources. So printing currency and giving it to them means less productivity and more consumption. You therefore have more currency units chasing an ever smaller pool of goods and services, driving up prices. To this was added the disorganisation of the railway administration, of the post office, and in general of all activities exercised by the state, all of whose accounts showed enormous deficits. Because of the wretched functioning of the bureaucratic machinery, of the decadence of state authority, and of the tenacious opposition of interested parties, taxes yielded little. Because the revolutionary socialist government of Weimar also didn't want to raise taxes to cover their spending, it was unpopular to raise taxes, they believed that currency printing was the easier option because the sheeple wouldn't know that they were being robbed. Now, printing paper currency and giving it to foreigners in exchange for imported goods did help ease the pressure on the German people in the immediate post-war period, but this only created a major problem in the future, which we'll come back to. Also, because of the terrible state of state finances, the deficit in the first 3 months of 1919 was over 3 million gold marks, which, given the rising value of gold, worked out to roughly 7.41 million paper marks. Yes, the state was spending way more than they were earning. It's also interesting that, even by 1919, the price of a gold mark had decoupled from the paper mark and was climbing rapidly. We have to remember that the gold price in 1914 was officially 1-to-1, meaning it took one paper mark to buy a gold mark. Well, by January 1919, that had increased to 2 paper marks per gold mark, and by April 1919 would increase by 50% to over 3 paper marks per gold mark. Gold was in more demand than paper. But, paradoxically, the German people still had complete confidence in the paper mark at this point. Even in mid-1919, before Versailles was signed, they continued to hoard currency, stuffing it under their mattresses. Part of the reason for this was because they expected the purchasing power of the mark to improve once conditions returned to normal. In other words, they thought the rising prices were transitory, and they thought, basically, that the mark was on sale. If the price of something is low, you buy it in the hope that the price will go up. Well, the same principle applied to the mark. It was low, so maybe it will go up in the future. Therefore, better hoard it now, right? In addition to the economic issues, there was massive political instability, making people fearful to spend. For example, you had a load of people either fighting to seize power or fighting to prevent a seizure of power, and neither group were actually working. Between the 9th of November 1918, when the revolution began, and the 19th of January 1919, when the elections of the National Assembly were held, the Social Democrats' attitude towards violence changed from a reluctance to use violence to a determination to use violence to establish its authority, again proving that it wasn't weak. The catalyst for change came as a result of the Spartacist uprising and the murders of Liebknecht and Luxemburg, as mentioned in the previous video. For the first 5 months of 1919, opponents were now brutally put down, including another Soviet republic that was declared in Bremen. The rule of the state was imposed. From this point on, all opposition to the government's policies would be aggressively suppressed by a government determined to prove that it possessed the means and the will to rule. Uncomfortable as it might be for many historians of Germany's first democracy, who tend to prefer to stress that Weimar was born out of the elections on 19th of January and the constitution that followed, it is important to note that the Republic was also founded upon its ability to use force to display its power. This was actually welcomed by many people at the time because the Social Democrats' use of violence against fellow socialists and communists ironically alleviated the fear that society would collapse into revolutionary chaos. By upholding the rule of law through violence, the peaceful revolution was saved, and the violent revolution quashed, if you can believe that. Still, the wartime regulations and restrictions, plus the British blockade, which was still going on, resulted in a huge black market for goods and services. People and businessmen disobeyed the rules in order to get what they needed. Some food was allowed through the blockade despite French complaints, but there was still shortages. Industrial production in 1919 was only 42% of what it had been in 1913, and Germany was producing half as much grain as it had before the war, again proving that it wasn't just the British blockade causing the problems. Thus, imports were vital. Except the law of supply and demand reared its ugly head along with the inflation. The more something was in demand, the higher the cost, which was why between November 1918 and July 1919, the price of imported goods increased by 65%, and internal prices increased 42%, and the amount of currency in circulation increased 56%, the floating debt increased 58%, and the exchange rate of the mark to the dollar almost doubled. Let me put some concrete figures behind this. In 1914, there had been 2.7 billion or milliard paper marks floating about the economy. In November 1918, this number had risen tenfold to 27 billion marks. And if we compare that to the exchange rate of the dollar, before the war, the dollar had been worth just over 4 paper marks on the exchange in Berlin. By December 1918, it took nearly twice as many marks to buy a US dollar. The rate continued to decline to just over 12 marks to the dollar in April 1919 and 47 by the end of the year. So there was a bit of a delay. The mark had increased tenfold by November 1918, yet the exchange took until the end of 1919 to see that tenfold increase against the dollar. But the increase did happen, showing that the printing of currency was causing a slide in the value of the mark. However, not all the currencies performed this way. Before the war, the exchange was 20 marks per pound sterling, and in November 1918 it was 43, and even by June 1919 was only 60 marks. This wasn't a 10 times increase, leading some to falsely assume that printing currency had nothing to do with the mark's depreciation. But when you factor in the fact that the British were also printing and inflating their currency as well, it explains why the exchange rate only fell as little as it did against the pound, whereas it fell more against the dollar. Also, we have to remember that gold marks were removed from circulation, and this changes the maths a little. There had been 6 billion gold and paper marks in circulation in mid-1914 and 32.9 billion paper marks by the end of 1918, an increase of only 5 times. The removal of the gold was actually deflationary in nature, although the overall number of currency units increased. So really, the currency only actually increased by about 5 times between 1914 and 1918. The exchange rate fell from 20 marks per pound to 60 by the June of 1919, which is 3 times. So given that the economic gears turn slower than the printing presses, causing a delay, and the fact that the British were inflating their currency during the war as well, it explains why the exchange only fell by 3 times the amount, not 5 or 10. Similarly, against the dollar, the exchange only fell from 4.2 in 1914 to 8.9 in January 1919, which is just more than double the amount. So again, with the delay, it makes perfect sense. And yes, Britain was printing currency too, as were the other powers. Britain had started the war with a circulation of £180 billion, and ended the war with more than double that, 394 billion. France had 8 billion francs before the war and ended it with 30 billion, which was roughly 4 times more than it had at the start. Wholesale prices in Germany, Great Britain and France at the end of 1918 were respectively 2.45, 2.30 and 3.53 times their pre-war height. In the United States, they were just about twice their 1913 level. So France's currency was doing worse than Germany's was doing in 1918. So far as inflation and government finances were concerned, therefore, the end of the war found the Reich in a position by no means hopeless. In fact, what's really interesting is that Germany's debt had grown, but not substantially more than any of the other warring powers. They were all in debt by a similar amount. A significant factor here, though, is that Germany had no long-term foreign debt, and most of its short-term foreign obligations were paid off in the early post-war years. I say it's a significant factor because hyperinflation has no effect on foreign debts. Hyperinflation only wipes out domestic debts, and 60% of the war had been financed by the sale of war bonds to the German people. That was 98 billion of the 160 billion cost of the fighting, and the German people were owed that by their own government. So, if the bulk of Germany's debt was domestic only, we owe it to ourselves, hyperinflation would be a very good way for the German government to get itself out of debt. Of course, it would also scam the German people out of the wealth they had loaned the government, But hey, who cares about those greedy bond-holding capitalists? Speaking of greed, things were quickly getting out of hand in Russia, which is worth going over because events there would have a direct impact on what was happening in Germany. After the November 1917 revolution, the ruble had lost half of its exchange value versus the US dollar, even though shares on the Petrograd Stock Exchange remained stable for a while. But the Soviets began to print it into oblivion. They also introduced their own Soviet currency in the February of 1919, by which point prices had increased 15-fold. Something that had cost 1 ruble in 1914 would, by July 1919, cost 657 rubles. Of course, they had abolished private property with the Bolshevik decree on land on the 26th of October 1917, and were now trying to centrally distribute food, which resulted in a disaster. When the peasants didn't cooperate with Lenin and refused to sell their grain to the state, which offered lower prices than the open market did, Lenin ordered them shot and sent armed Marxist activists into the countryside to seize the food from the tight-fisted kulaks. The problem, of course, being that nobody knew what a kulak was. Anyone could be labelled a kulak, from the person who lent neighbours money to one who kept a tidy garden. Lenin also threatened to take the ration cards off the workers who refused to join the requisition units, and to Marxists in one province, Lenin wrote, 1. Hang! Hang without fail so the people see. No fewer than 100 known kulaks, rich men, bloodsuckers. 2. Publish their names. 3. Take from them all the grain. 4. Designate hostages. Yes, the peasants were condemned to starve in the name of the workers, and if they resisted, they would be murdered. But in the end, the Bolsheviks had to turn a blind eye when it was realised that 80% of the food consumed in the cities was coming from the black market, not from the ironically named Commissariat of Supply. So they had a choice. They could either continue to implement socialism and starve the majority of the population, or they could let the economy actually work. Bearing in mind that most of what I've just described here had already occurred by the start of 1919. The reason all this is important is because the Germans were watching what was happening in Russia and knew that they couldn't implement socialism in the way that the Bolsheviks were attempting to do there. And this circles us back to the democracy versus socialism debate. The Social Democrats wanted democracy, which wasn't totalitarianism, but without totalitarianism you can't socialise the means of production. The Social Democrats have put at the top of their party programme the demand for socialisation, Vergesellschaftung, of the means of production. This would have been clear and unambiguous if people had been ready to interpret it as forceful expropriation of the means of production by the state, and consequently as government management of all branches of economic activity. But the Social Democrats emphatically asserted that this was not at all the meaning of their basic claim. Nationalisation, Verstaatlichung, and socialisation, they insisted, were two entirely different things. And they had to say that because they believed in democracy, but also because they claimed that the war economy hadn't been real socialism, but was actually state capitalism. So because they did this, there was no policy left for them to pursue. Socialism is the state ownership of the means of production, and if you deny that, then you have nothing. There's nothing left. Now, real socialisation had to start. But what did socialisation mean? It was, said the Marxians, neither the kind of thing represented by the nationalisation of state railroads, state mines, and so on, nor the war socialism of Zwangwirtschaft, compulsory economy. But what else could it be? Marxians of all groups had to admit that they did not know. For more than 50 years they had advocated socialisation as the focal point of their party programme. Now that they had seized power, they must start to execute their programme. Now they had to socialise, but at once it became apparent that they did not know what socialisation meant. It was really rather awkward. Again, the far-left communists will say that this proves that the Social Democrats were in with the capitalists and weren't real socialists. No, it proves that they are real socialists because it turns out that the majority of real socialists don't actually know what real socialism is. Besides, the Social Democrats still expected that capitalism would be overthrown and that socialism, whatever that meant, would replace it. So yes, it might be argued that Weimar Germany had a capitalist economy, although it certainly didn't have a free market one, but the Social Democrats were still Marxist socialists. Now, while Germany had started to feel the effects of inflation and Russia had collapsed into a communist paradise, socialist Austria was already suffering terribly from what was a very similar scenario. Hunger had become a real issue. The average citizen lacked access to basic goods, especially potatoes, sugar, and coal. The cornerstone of the new economic system was the printing press of the Austro-Hungarian Bank. Tax revenue was far too low to pay for the various government handouts, and increasing the tax rate was both politically impossible and likely to be inadequate to increase the revenue sufficiently in any case. New debts could not be incurred because there was not enough money left over to lend, and the government's credit was terrible. No one expected it to pay back the pile of debts it had amassed during the war. There was therefore only one way for the new government to establish a large-scale welfare state: print more money. That's why the Austrian currency, the krone, collapsed quicker than the mark was doing. In December 1918, the price of flour was 50 times as much as it had been before the war, and the unofficial black market price for flour was 4 times the official price, proving once again that price controls don't work. People were already resorting to barter. All Austrians, but especially those with savings, watched horrified as the value of their money fell. People began to gamble on the stock market in an attempt to hold on to their wealth. People sold all their possessions, furniture, carpets, pianos, to the foreign visitors who held gold. Bank officials were advising people to get out of the krone and buy foreign gold and silver, but people weren't used to this idea. They still held on to the belief that the currency would recover. I went to see the bank official who always advised me. "Well, wasn't I right?" he said. "If you had bought Swiss francs when I suggested, you would not now have lost 3/4 of your fortune." "Lost?" I exclaimed in horror. "Why, don't you think the krone will recover again?" "Recover?" he said with a laugh. "Just test the promise made on this 20 kronen note and try and get, say, 20 silver kronen in exchange." "Yes, but mine are government securities. Surely there can't be anything safer than that." "My dear lady, where is the state which guaranteed these securities to you? It is dead." Otto Bauer, head of the Austrian Social Democrats, was unofficially the guy in charge, even though he was technically the foreign minister. Basically, Bauer had more influence than Karl Renner did, who was the chancellor. Bauer was a devout Marxist along with his wife, and they wanted to not only introduce communism to Austria, but also forge close ties with the Bolsheviks in Russia. Luckily for the Austrian people, one of Bauer's advisors and long-term personal acquaintance since they were students was Ludwig von Mises, who sacrificed their friendship in order to persuade the Bauers not to go through with their plan. At that time, I succeeded in convincing the couple that a Bolshevist experiment in Austria would have to collapse in short order, perhaps in a few days. Austria depended on the importation of food from abroad, which was made possible only through relief assistance from former enemies. At no time during the first 9 months after the armistice did Vienna have a supply of food for more than 8 or 9 days. Without lifting a finger, the Allies could have forced the surrender of a Bolshevist regime in Vienna. Few people clearly recognized this state of affairs. Everyone was so convinced on the inevitability of the coming Bolshevism that they were intent merely on securing for themselves a favourable position in the new order. The Catholic Church and its followers, that is, the Christian Social Party, were ready to welcome Bolshevism with the same ardor archbishops and bishops 20 years later welcomed Nazism. Bank directors and big industrialists hoped to earn a good living as managers under Bolshevism. I knew what was at stake. In a few days, Bolshevism in Vienna would have created starvation and terror. Plundering hordes would soon have roamed the streets of Vienna and, in a second bloodbath, would have destroyed the remnants of Viennese culture and civilization. Throughout many nights, I discussed these problems with the Bauers until I finally succeeded in convincing them. The resulting restraint of Bauer determined the course of events in Vienna. Otto Bauer was too intelligent not to realise that I was right, but he could never forgive me for having made him take the position of a moderate socialist. Some seizure of property, expropriation or socialisation did take place in Austria, but the damage was limited thanks to Mises. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to stop them increasing the price controls that had been implemented in the First World War, and this exasperated the economic disaster that was unfolding in the country. Still, the worst outcome had been avoided. It was solely due to my efforts that Bolshevism did not prevail in Vienna. Only a few people had supported me in my efforts, and their help was rather ineffective. I alone managed to turn Bauer away from seeking union with Moscow. Mises had saved Austria, but the country was still in turmoil, as was Germany, as the inflation situation worsened. Worse, the Allies were scheming to punish Germany for her aggression in the First World War, meeting at Versailles to determine her fate. We'll be discussing that treaty and the reparations and the continuing crisis in the next and future episodes, so be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Thanks for watching, bye for now.